Hi everyone. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're going to give it one more minute, folks, and then we'll get started. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, alrighty. So I'm excited to be here with you today. So the topic of today's discussion is why your 4.0 got rejected and what actually gets you in. So really excited to be covering this material given that admissions decisions have just come out for the Ivies, including Harvard. I first want to talk a little bit about me, who I am. I'm a Harvard graduate and former admissions interviewer. I've been working with students for over 15 years, helping them navigate this process that is quite perplexing and challenging for folks. And I really enjoy helping students put together the narrative that sets them apart. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. So, based in Southern California, where I was born and raised, I have also over 20 years experience in test prep. I got a perfect SAT score, and I've worked with lots of students helping them in their admissions journeys. So let's talk about the topic of today's discussion, which is the 4.0. Thousands of students have this magic number, a perfect GPA. It's as good as it gets when it comes to your academics. However, the vast majority of 4.0 students are getting rejected at the top 20 schools. We're looking at less than a 5% acceptance rate. So the question that comes to mind is that if you've got strong grades and scores, what is it that's keeping these types of students out? And furthermore, what gets these types of students in? And that's what I want to talk to you today about, because I know that's front and center in the minds of many students and families. So today we're going to go through a bit of an explanation on why a 4.0 isn't enough. And then we're going to talk about some of the biggest mistakes that students make. Okay, so please pay special attention to that. And then we'll also talk about what schools actually want in terms of signaling, and then real examples on, what it takes to win in this process. So we did get a question, is this focused on undergrad admissions or graduate? This is going to be focused on undergrad. And I also encourage everyone to hold their questions until the very end. So let's talk about the myth of the 4.0, the most optimal GPA a student can have. So oftentimes, students who have these 4.0 GPAs are taking the most rigorous courses at their schools, AP, IB, honors, the hardest schedule available. And in terms of extracurriculars, right, they're doing as good as they can. They are involved, sports, clubs, community service, leadership roles. And even then, if you have all of these three elements, and of course the third element, the extracurriculars, has nothing to do with academics, it's not enough in most cases. So you get a seat at the table when it comes to having your application being reviewed with a little more diligence. But at the majority of applicants that are rejected at schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford, they are academically qualified. They're very smart, they're very gifted. But there's a reason between why you can be potentially considered for admission and then actually getting in. And sort of that gap is what we focus on here at Open Admits to help students really set themselves apart and shine. So, talking about, the question of what actually gets you in. So let's think about, what admissions is asking versus not asking. They're not asking, is the student qualified for your school? For our school, I should say. And so, by the time they open your file, your academic qualifications have spoken for themselves, okay? It's understood that you have the academic chops in most cases, if you have a 4.0. The better question, and this is something that you should think about as an applicant, is, why this student over the thousands of others, right? So every officer is searching for a compelling special reason to choose you. And if you can't meet that question, it won't survive the pile, okay? And, the first thing is, in terms of why you don't make it, you look like everyone else. And I'm not saying physically, but in terms of how you present on paper. So, a typical rejected profile could have a 4.0 GPA, a 1580 SAT, 10 plus clubs, lots of leadership, sports, volunteering. And while this is impressive on paper, if there isn't a clear identity and a distinctive voice that's come through the application, this profile blends in with the other applicants. Okay, 50,000 plus in many instances. So you haven't really set yourself apart. That's the first reason. And the second reason is, you have no clear narrative. Now, this is actually one of the more interesting aspects of, I think, developing yourself as an applicant and thinking about, okay, like how you can set yourself apart. So let's say you've played a sport, you volunteered at a food bank, you're leading a robotics club, you're doing all of the right things. But if you haven't brought those together in a cohesive story in terms of your essays and your activities and your recommendation letters, and the additional information section even in your application, then you're not really able to develop a clear story, right? All of your activities, all of your courses, all of the things that you've done in high school are elements of a much larger picture that you're seeking to create in your applications, okay? So they're not entries from different diaries or just snapshots in time. You're trying to weave together some very interesting themes about you. So what does a strong narrative look like? Okay, so first off, talking about what you care about, right? Do you reflect on your passions, not simply your achievements? Okay, the achievement essay is often the most common essay that is just overlooked and rejected by admissions committees. They really want to know the real you. But let's come back to this idea of a passion. What have you done about it? Did you take concrete steps to pursue this over time? Right? Did it have, was there sustained commitment? Was there initiative and follow through? And then also thinking about what impact have you made, right? Measurable real world change, right? Who benefited, who shifted, how many people were affected? Were the people that were affected maybe people who were vulnerable, at risk, at need, what have you? Okay? So all of that ties into building this narrative. And then, also talk about kind of surface involvement, all right? So participation is not impact. So what is surface involvement? It means you showed up, but you didn't go the extra mile, okay? A lot of students, particularly around community service, are caught up with this idea of maintaining a certain number of volunteer hours or getting a title, right? But maybe that title just means member, there's, something that's just, generic, okay? But they're not really going into leadership. And so leadership means, leading, building, creating, owning different aspects of an initiative or an organization. So when your involvement is very surface level in whatever it is that you're saying you care about, then you're unable to really develop yourself, package yourself in a way that is compelling for colleges. So depth over breadth also. So, another thing to consider is that one of the most, persistent myths is about that well-rounded student, right? Maybe you need to have a sport, an instrument, an art, this, that. And so many students become obsessed with that. And parents too, even early on, 7th and 8th grade. And so a lot of what you're doing starts to look like resume padding, okay? And so what's important is as you're going through high school is that you're focusing on a spiked approach. And so what does that mean? That means to go deep in 2 to 3 areas rather than simply being, at a surface level with 12 different activities. So you really want to showcase mastery, leadership, real world impact, okay? So when you're memorably the best at a few different things, that's better than being moderately okay at 12 different ones. And that's sort of what we call the spike approach, where you're setting yourself off from the pack. And then there's also poor positioning, okay? So, and particularly in the essays, activity descriptions, recommendations, they're not reinforcing a very single unified identity, right? That is driving how you are positioning yourself. Then you will not succeed. You'll often find yourself flailing. You'll be wondering, well, I did all of the right things and I got all the right scores and I saw what other kids were doing when they were applying to Ivy Leagues and got in, and I didn't have that experience. And so remember, your application is not a list of items, it's a story. And how does that holistic story really set yourself apart? So let's look at this case study. Okay, so you've got similar grades and scores between these two. And then you have on the left, somebody who's making some of those mistakes that I'm telling you about. They focused on hours for volunteering. They're a varsity athlete. Their essays were very generic. We see these all the time. It's all about making a difference. They don't really quantify the impact of what they've done in their activities. They're simply a high achiever, and they're more often than not waitlisted and denied at the top 20 schools. And then you've got somebody else who maybe founded one organization, they led a major initiative in another organization, they did a lot of research in a particular field, and the application, every component reinforced a single narrative. Okay, so essays showed specific impact. So 300 students served. They published findings, invited to speak at a conference. As a result, then they actually get admitted to some of these top schools. So clarity, depth, and strategic positioning. Okay, that's what's really important. And you can build that over 3 years, 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, such that you can apply as a 12th grader and really set yourself apart. So what actually gets people in, okay, what actually gets you in are the following. Academic strength, right, having rigorous courses, being able to do well in those courses, having a clear narrative. That means you've spent a lot of time really thinking and reflecting on who you are, who you want to be, and you're letting that shine in your application. And this is where you're frequently spending many, many hours working with, your college counselor, both building your profile and then also packaging yourself. Then depth. So depth is the opposite of resume padding. So you're basically, really focusing on a few key areas and then using that to drive your profile. You're also showcasing impact. So you're able to, highlight meaningful contributions that you've made to your school or your community, a particular field. And to the extent that you can showcase evidence, then that's important. And then the positioning, right? The narrative, the activities, etc. All of that, kind of bringing that together, that helps you, in the application. And a lot of that takes years, right? This isn't something that you can just, click your fingers and expect to have really amazing results. You'd want to be working with a coach like myself year over year for many years. So what does impact mean? So when I always think of impact with students, I think about quantification, right? Instead of saying I volunteered and helped my community, you would rather want to say something like I launched a tutoring program serving 180 Title I students across 3 schools, raising average math scores by X% over, this period of time. So who did you help? How many people were impacted? What changed? Okay? So that's really, really important. So if you're an adult on this call, think about how people have coached you when it comes to your resume for work. These are the types of things that employers are looking for when they're, perusing your resume. And similarly, in the college application process, defining your impact is very, very critical. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do to set yourself apart. And oftentimes students get stuck because they don't know what to do, right? They're less worried. They're not worried about the story, or they don't know what their story is, but they still are struggling to find what types of activities they can get involved in. So like starting a nonprofit, right? Identifying a real community need, building an organization from scratch, okay? Recruiting volunteers, things of that nature. Research. Here at Open Admits, we have a strong emphasis on research and internships. So doing original research in a field that interests you is pretty important. Building a community is also really important. Okay, creating a platform, publication, gathering space, bringing people together, and then leading a major initiative, right? So transforming an existing organization, doing something. So sometimes you don't even need to build out that organization yourself, or found it, I should say. But if you can start something new within an existing organization, that can be very powerful. So think about a volunteer group at your school. If you're leading an initiative to reach out to senior homes in your local area and bring volunteers to them, that looks really good. So what are these top schools that we're always talking about in the news really looking for? They're looking for initiative, right? They're looking, did you see a problem and act? Okay. In terms of curiosity, do you pursue ideas beyond the classroom because you generally can't stop thinking about them? So intellectual curiosity is really a huge, huge part. an applicant's profile. Leadership, have you moved people, built something, changed the direction of a group? It doesn't always mean having a title. Sometimes you can do great things without necessarily having a big title. So that's important. And then authenticity, does your application feel like a real person, right? Or is it simply a performance of what you think that people want to see? So again, top schools aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for what sets you apart. And students, they want students who will change their institutions, not just simply succeed within. So some of the common mistakes that we see with students is too many activities, so the resume padding, so joining 12 different clubs and not really being able to focus on a few things that would really set them apart. Additionally, chasing prestige, simply pursuing opportunities because they look impressive, maybe doing a bunch of pre-college programs in the summers, trying to angle for an internship with a professor at a big university, but not really being authentic. Another thing that we see frequently is simply starting too late. So if you're starting the summer before senior year to build out your profile, it is way too late. To have a genuine spike in your profile, you need a few years. So students who begin strategizing in 11th grade are already behind those that are in 9th grade doing this. And then there are folks who simply just have no strategy. They're like, I'm going to try out all the different things in high school and see what makes sense, and then ultimately go from there. And if that's you, then having no strategy can be a cause of your failure. And oftentimes that happens when you don't have a college counselor helping you every step of the way. So your timeline also matters. Okay, so we've talked about starting early. Okay, and then so year over year, here's what you should be thinking about. In 9th and 10th grade, you should be trying different interests, finding activities that genuinely excite you, take risks. It's the time to discover, not to optimize. And then in 10th and 11th grade, you can be building depth. You can go really deep on a couple different areas, maybe create something, lead something, found something, start an organization or an initiative. Do things that will really help you have some measurable impact. Okay, and this is where that spike comes into play. And then in 11th and 12th grade, you're doing a lot of the packaging, right? You're crafting your narrative. Even in 11th grade, you're writing essays for prestigious summer programs. So you start to see that positioning kick in. And then, in 12th grade, you're actually doing, you're creating the activity descriptions and recommendations, and you're telling this clear story. And then you're basically applying strategically to different schools that may be considered reach, realistic, and safety. And so you're able to really differentiate yourself. Okay, so the early strategy, it's not pressure, it's an advantage. It's really understanding that you need to start early in 9th grade and work hard so that your application can be different by 12th grade. So ultimately, you've probably heard this many times, work smart, not just hard. Of course, you do need to work hard. You need to take the most challenging classes, do well, get good grades. But what do top students do differently? They ask, how do I do more? How do I build something that no one else has built in the same way? They identify their unique intersection of passion and talent. They're investing in different aspects of their profile, and they're looking to differentiate themselves. So you want to think strategically, not just like a student who's taking classes. So how can you build a winning profile? Okay, so you can identify your core interests, right? What problems do you find yourself thinking about late into the night? What subjects interest you, right? What are some of your genuine passions? Think about your activities, right? Make sure there's an idea or theme that you're building on that relates to the core part of who you are, right? Build depth over time, right? Start something, lead something. Particularly in 10th and 11th grade, that's a great time to start an initiative or a club. Think about impact, like I said, and then tell a clear, compelling story. Now, this last point, for students of mine who are rising 12th graders, they're already starting that process now, where between now and November 1st, when they hit their first deadlines, they are spending 6 to 7 months doing the packaging, thinking about their activity lists and their recommendations and their essays, right? So that colleges understand who is this person and why do we want them there. And then just something for all the parents out there. I know we have a few parents on this call. If you're in this room, right, this is for you. Think about It's getting more competitive than ever. The GPA, simply getting that 4.0 is not enough. And so you really do want to start early as 8th or ninth grade. And that can help your student truly distinguish themselves. So some things to think about, the 4.0, again, it's not going to be enough. Depth over breadth, right? Being good in a few key areas is more important than being good than trying to be good in, multiple areas, like 12 to 13 or more areas. And then positioning. And that's where it's important to work with a qualified counselor that can help you build out that narrative that's going to help you succeed in this process. Okay, so now I want to take some time for some Q&A. So if there are any students on the call, we can go through some, specifics around your profile. For parents, maybe you have some questions on how you can get started. What are some of the key considerations you need to be thinking about? And then for everyone, if you're neither a parent or a student, feel free to, offer any questions or bring up any questions you've had based on what we've talked about today. So out of curiosity, what grade are your students in? I know we've got Debbie and Lalit and Jyoti. Okay, 8th grade. All right, nice. Okay, any questions, folks? Okay, when is a good time to start with a coach? So actually the 8th grade is a wonderful time. So if your student's currently in the 8th grade, there's a lot of planning that you can be doing to help them as consider the summer, 9th grade. Typically from a planning perspective, the things we focus on are academics, activities, community service, standardized testing, summer planning, and college and major research. So now is a terrific time for them. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so if you do have, what if the child is a gifted child? Does that increase their chances? Yeah, that's another terrific question. Not necessarily. So just because you are a gifted child does not boost your chances. You do have to build out your profile in the way that I've described. So, and this is where we are at Open Admits, a boutique college counseling practice. So we do that personalized counseling. We talk about long-term strategy, and we help you with, application support end-to-end, the essays, the interview prep, school list strategy, activity lists, etc. So if you'd like, you can email me, john@openadmits.com, to book a free consult, okay? So even if you think it's very early for your student, feel free to contact me at this email address, john@openadmits.com, and we can schedule some time for a free consultation. Okay, so this is a great question. What distinguishes admissions to Harvard, Yale, Stanford versus other top 10 schools? We see admissions to be sometimes random, exactly one getting into Harvard but rejected from Brown, for example. So typically for the top 10 schools, the bar is very high, and in any given year, they may have certain preferences for students based on geography, demographics, interests, major, etc. Now, as you all probably know, there is no longer affirmative action in the college admissions process. However, there is some discretion that universities have in terms of admitting students based on their particular demographic background, geography, interests. Sometimes certain schools are known to, more highly for a certain major. So for instance, Wharton at Penn is, the best undergrad program in business or finance. So consider that a student applying to Wharton versus a student, or a student for whom Wharton is the number one choice versus Harvard might be a little bit different in terms of their profile and their orientation. Great questions, everyone. So again, john@openadmits.com. Feel free to email me if you'd like, a free consult. Okay, another question. Would I design the profile differently if one aims for Harvard, etc.? I designed the profile based on the student's interests and needs. That ultimately is the driver, right, to make that student unique rather than solutioning on the back end, right? So that helps you differentiate yourself. Okay, any other questions, folks? So I'm also going to type in my email in the chat, john@openadmits.com. You can reach out to me there. I hope you found this session helpful. We'll have some upcoming webinars I look forward to presenting at. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you again. And I look forward to hearing from you all soon.